Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jaime Ho from the Straits Times in Singapore. Thank you so much for joining us at this session. The title is Aligning the Three Nature Markets. I have in front of me, obviously, a very distinguished panel. We're going to talk about basically the three nature markets, which are biodiversity, water, and carbon, and how best, I suppose, to value, protect, and drive capital towards the protection of our natural ecosystems via the natural capital markets. I'm going to start this conversation first with President Tharman Shanmugaratnam. As you all know, he is the president of Singapore and close to all our hearts. And he's also the co-chair of the Global Commission on Economy of Water. So I'm going to start the conversation with him, and then Sherry Madsen from CDP, Mads Christensen from Greenpeace, and Cenk Alper from Sabanci Holdings in Turkey. Mr. President, why don't you start us off?
Okay, thank you. Well, first let me say something which has to be very basic to our understanding of these three different nature markets. They are deeply intertwined. They're actually not three different markets. They're really one challenge we face in the shifting ecology of the planet. And that challenge of global warming, water scarcity, and the fact that the global water cycle is out of kilter, and the progressive loss of biodiversity are reinforcing each other, and they are now a vicious circle. So to put it simply, if we don't manage water well, if we let soil health deteriorate and you lose moisture in the soil, if you degrade the wetlands, you also reduce carbon sequestration, which accelerates global warming, and global warming then dries the soil, leads to further problems in the forests, and you get that vicious cycle. So we're dealing with something which the science is very clear on, but it must then be reflected in our governance approaches, in our policies, in our financing strategies, including some of one of the very important areas of potential, which is developing the market for credits. Just like we've got carbon credits, we need to develop the market for water credits and biodiversity credits. And I'll come to that in a moment. Nature-based solutions are a big thing. They're an extremely important part of global warming mitigation, climate change mitigation. You can argue about exactly what percentage of mitigation should come down to nature-based solutions. But we know that there's so much good that arises from nature-based solutions that's not just about reducing carbon emissions or capturing more carbon, but also about all the other core benefits of nature-based solutions. Reduce pollution, reduce heat, improved disease management, a whole set of other benefits. But think of nature-based solutions not just in terms of carbon. Think of nature-based solutions as a way of managing water, carbon emissions, and preserving biodiversity. Because if you think of them together, the ripple effect is much larger. Give you an example. We need to transform the agri-food industry. Regenerative in agriculture, which is already well underway in many parts of the world, will preserve soil health, it'll preserve carbon in the soil, it'll improve yields with the appropriate incentives, the appropriate technologies, and I don't use technologies with a big T. These are really very mature technologies that help farmers. It helps farmers, it helps consumers. Think of rice, which is a major issue in Asia especially. It's also some other parts of the world. We have to move fundamentally from a predominant system of rice cultivation, which you call paddy cultivation, and you flood the fields, which leads to high methane emissions, leads to farmers pumping water from under the ground using energy, and also uses a lot of water that gets wasted. With more sustainable rice production, using now fairly mature, well-understood techniques, alternative wetting and drying, direct seeding of rice, drip irrigation, and so on. With those alternative methods, you save 50% of methane emissions, you save 30% of water, and you save a very significant proportion, about more than 30% in energy that we use to power the pumps. So it's an example of how you can, through solutions that are holistic nature-based solutions, you address all three problems at the same time. And you have to remember that agriculture is also the biggest source of deforestation and the loss of biodiversity. But it brings me then to financing, because nature-based solutions are significantly underfunded. It's rested largely on governments, and the private sector is still at a very preliminary stage of getting into nature-based investments, preserving nature as a way of addressing climate change. The carbon credits market has an infrastructure, it has an ecosystem. There were integrity issues, there were greenwashing issues. There's significant improvement happening now. The ICVCM, the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative. There's a lot of good work taking place there to improve integrity and improve trust in the markets. And I believe this is going to be a very significant source of financing for nature-based solutions. Now, I think it'll be very difficult to create a whole ecosystem for water credits, sustainable water credits, biodiversity credits, and side by side with carbon credits. It can be done in theory, but it's going to exhaust the private sector and it's going to exhaust negotiators. Much better that we work on a reliable carbon credit system with a stapling on of water and biodiversity credits. It's still at its infancy. There are biodiversity credits that are currently being stapled on, and it's being done rather qualitatively because we don't yet have precise quantitative ways of assessing biodiversity benefits in a way that can be compared across different projects and different regions and geographies. In other words, there's no common currency. But even the qualitative approach has led to significant premiums, about 12% premium on carbon credits that have biodiversity stapled onto it. And likewise, we can do the same with water. And remember the point I made earlier, that water will not just enhance the value of the carbon credits, it also allows the benefits to be reaped earlier and in a way that local communities see as benefiting themselves. It's not just for the private sector, not just for the markets. People see the benefits. So I think the WEF should work with other coalitions to develop some rigor in this process. How do we develop the biodiversity and water credit markets? And ideally, from a practical point of view, I would say, how do we then staple it on to carbon credits in a new high-integrity, nature-based carbon credits market?
Thanks so much, President. I'm going to turn the floor now to Sherry. I think it's quite fortuitous because she's in the business of data, and underpinning a lot of what President Tharman has just said is the need for reliable data, credible data of integrity. What's your mindset in terms of what's needed to make sure the three markets coalesce? And what are the related sort of realistic timeframes that you're thinking about? And our emerging technology is going to be there to allow us to make sure that the data sets talk to each other, for lack of a better terminology. But why don't you just go ahead?
Great. Well, thank you, Jamie, and thank you to the WEF for raising this topic, because I think it's incredibly timely. CDP has been collecting data for 25 years. And again, we are known as collecting climate data. But few know is that actually we've been collecting water and forestry and land use data for over 10 years. And again, now we're calling it biodiversity. Now we're calling it nature data. But the reality is that actually a number of companies, cities, states, and regions around the world have been doing this for many years, and that's encouraging. I think that what we're actually pivoting into, and why this discussion is so timely now, is we shouldn't be talking about climate and nature. We should be talking about how we make things Earth positive, and try and make sure that actually all of these interacting goals are really starting to hone down to what is the data that we need to check on so that we know if we're actually making progress or not. It's not only anymore about targets or about the philosophy of where it is that we want to go. And even at the project level, we really need to make sure that we are tracking and tracing. I've got some good news, because this all sounds like a bit of a burden. Right? This sounds like another layer. More company data is needed. The reality is that companies are very much willing to lean in, especially when their own business is seeing the impacts of a natural world that isn't supporting their business of the future. And so what CDP has been doing is integrating our questions so that it includes the biodiversity questions side by side with some of the more traditional climate questions. If you think about scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emissions, they're sitting alongside water scarcity, water management, thinking about forestry and land use. And great news is over the course of 1 year, last year, from 2023 to 2024, the number of respondents to biodiversity-related questions went up by 42%. So there is a willingness and an eagerness to be able to get the data in order to be able to direct our action going forward. That's exciting. I think that, President Tharman, you're right, that when you talk about underfunding, if we think about how we deploy capital at scale in order to be able to solve the world's biggest problems, we do need that common currency, if I can use your phrase. And actually, part of this common currency needs to be that we agree what those data sets are and make sure that they are global and borderless. And again, perhaps this is a page we can learn from climate that maybe we didn't do so well, which is that in our eagerness and in our positive intent, we've created a lot of different questions for stakeholders around the world. And as investors, there are a lot of questions that go into the corporate environment. I have the luxury and privilege of speaking to many of the world's largest multinationals, as well as smaller companies, private companies, suppliers of those multinationals. They say the same thing to me, which is, Sherry, please help me bring down the burden of reporting. And if you can do that, the dollars that I'm spending on reporting are dollars I will put into climate and nature and earth positive action. And that is a call to arms I'm actually very willing to lean into. So let's make sure that the data sets that we are looking at in this community become really common, really clear. And I think that there are some very good indicators that we are going in that direction. So we work closely with the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures. And of course, TCFD has become one of the acronyms that certainly climate data is married to now, which is great, and it's moving into ISSB, and off we go. So CDP is aligning our questions so that you can really clearly see what that question is in relation to, and TNFD is a strong partner to do that. So let's try and make sure that we're not recreating the wheel along the way, and think about the data that we already have. Make sure that we're not adding burden, but every question we ask from any of us as stakeholders, regulators, government, customers, investors, are actually going towards a use case. And that's our new mission as CDP, not only to disclose, but to make sure that we're sharing that information in a right once, use many way, absolutely including nature.
Thanks, Sherry. You raised many good questions, which I think Cenk will be forced to answer once I turn the floor to him in good time in terms of how businesses are playing in this. But Mads, maybe we take a step back first and take things from your perspective, where you see the role of nature markets. Because as President Tharman has suggested, and as Sherry sort of mentioned very briefly, there were things that we didn't do so well when it came to climate reporting, when it came to climate action. So from your perspective at Greenpeace, how do you see this going forward? And in the ideal world, how are we going to bring these three markets together?
Well, first of all, of course, it's wonderful that we increasingly talk about these interconnected crises, and we have to find the solutions in things that can also address the crisis at the same time. And I would add a few more, right? I mean, we have a poverty, we have social crisis, we have a lot of injustice in the system that we need to consider as well as we address the two most important planetary crises that we are talking about today. So that's super good, and thanks to VEF for raising that in that way. And obviously, I think it's super encouraging to hear about the methodology, the increased use of data, etc. But I think it's also fair to say that I am a lot more skeptical to the ability of us of creating a market-based solution here. I mean, in Greenpeace, we have many different concerns when it comes to nature-based or market-based solutions to the nature side. I think the commodification of nature, sort of driven by short-term financial considerations, risk to deepen the problems that we are facing, right? I mean, it's not that we are against in Greenpeace at all that we get to a situation where polluters pay for the pollution that they create, and we're certainly not there yet. Not even on the ones that are most simple, which is probably carbon emissions at source or at burning, right? I mean, right now it's a quarter of the emissions that are covered by emission trading schemes, right? And we are certainly not against either that those who are profiting from the use of natural resources or the common goods are also taxed in a fair way for that. And of course, we're not against either that we see a paradigm shifts where increasingly the private sector shifts focus towards whatever you want to call it, earth positive or nature positive solutions. That mindset shift we definitely need, right? But nature market as such, right? At least as we've seen them over the last 25 years, where we tried and tried, offsets, credits, right, has just led to quite perverse outcomes. I mean, I think fundamentally, I think it's about that nature is too complex, right? We cannot capture all the different dimensions of nature. We can capture some of them with data, right? But the value that it poses to individuals, the love for nature, the energy you get from nature, the indigenous connections to nature, how do you capture those in single metrics? I think this is the concern. How do you get to a richest sort of baseline, the monitoring elements to it, right? So I think we need to be super careful when applying sort of market logic, at least when it comes to sort of the creditization of it. I think there is a real risk that nature markets will delay real action, right, and will create the same kind of dynamics that we've seen for carbons, right, where rich companies, rich countries can buy cheap credits in the global south. Obviously, it's clear that there is a funding gap, right, and it's embarrassing that commitments made over the years by governments, by corporates, whether it's on nature, whether it's on carbon, has not been met, right? And this needs to be addressed. And I think it's quite clear that well-designed polluters pay regimes are an important funding source, right? And I'm absolutely certain, especially if the funding then goes back to actual sort of nature protection or climate, which we don't see today, right? Maybe it's around half of the carbon tax that we're gathering around the world that goes back. But there's certainly other ways we can do it as well. I think both the CBD Kali fund that is voluntarily, right, but is based on a principle of contributions from sectors that make commercial use of digital assets, and how they can contribute. We have similar conversations in the Global Oceans Treaty, BBNJ, where there's also very good suggestions. And I think we have also many other examples of how we can make sort of that link between polluters pay, those who use nature, and make funding flows work there. And then we haven't even started talking about how we fix our fundamental problems in our tax systems, right? The inequities that we see there, how we tax the most wealthy people in the world right now. I think we have huge potential there. Recent analysis shows that maybe in Europe alone, $200 billion can be found just by increasing wealth taxes in the same way that Spain has done. On a global scale, that would be 3-4 times that amount. Tax evasion, equally harmful subsidies, right? So we have, it's clear that there is a funding gap, right? But I would challenge the scarcity narrative. It is more that we have not done our job well enough in actually finding the sources.
Thanks, Matt. Cenk, so you have actually two sets of questions to sort of respond to now. You run a huge conglomerate with interests across various sectors. So make the point that, you know, in response to Matt's, where do you see the use of nature markets in helping you drive action across your portfolio? And make the case, I suppose, that this is something positive. There's something that will actually help you do the, as Jerry said, earth positive actions that as the business you can aspire to.
Yeah. On one side, I am full supporter of tackling with these three markets together, carbon, water, and biodiversity together. But on the other side, I'm afraid that trying to integrate them together can slow down us. And we don't have time. Last night we have listened once again, Johan Rockström. We are behind our targets. So cost of inaction is extremely expensive today. And if we look to biodiversity credits and carbon credits, there are some fundamental differences. One, biodiversity has an intrinsic value. So keeping nature intact is more important than restoring nature. There is value already in it. Whereas carbon, we have to remove it as early as possible, as much as possible. Second, additionality issue. So yes, restoring. Can you find any financier today to keep the nature intact? No. They will give us credits to restore the nature, but they will not give us credits to keep the nature intact. That's also a problem. So how are we going to integrate carbon markets? Yes, they are established, they are working right now, functioning right now, so that might slow us down a little bit. Third, nature has a latency. So any project that we do in nature can return at least in 10 years. At least we can measure our impact to the nature at least in 10 years, whereas carbon is immediate. Hourly we can measure carbon, and then we can get credits on that carbon. So that's also a fundamental difference. And Mr. President mentioned that water and biodiversity is local, whereas carbon is global. So we have one globe, and then we can compensate that. So those are the major differences. In that respect, yes, we have to combine them because there is an already functioning carbon market, but we should not let integration efforts slow us down for carbons, because cost of inaction is extremely important. And it's not voluntary markets or free markets. Taxes, subsidies should be aligned also accordingly. You are right. Excavation activities, for example, should be taxed probably much higher than the other activities. So those are the major differences. And my final comment over there, actually, we have to adapt our economies to the nature, not the nature to our economies. That's extremely critical.
Thanks, Jack. Very good points, and I'll get President Tharman and Sherry to respond to the two sets of issues. One, we don't have enough time in integrating the three markets, and two, that is too complex. So maybe, Sherry, you take the two complex questions second, but maybe I'll just turn the floor to President Tharman to respond to some of the concerns that Jack has raised.
I think the concerns are valid. We should all start with an understanding that we are well behind the curve on every front. Government action on carbon pricing, on mandates, and even on setting a very clear moral and political tone that has to drive climate action. We are behind in the development of the markets. We are behind in every form of financing. That also gives us a sense of reality. How do we get from a situation where we are at today, which I don't think is happenstance, it's not accidental, it's part and parcel of the very complex political economy of climate action, particularly when you're dealing with a problem where resolving the problem will give benefits quite some ways down the road. Of course, you get some immediate benefits, but the most important benefits come decades from now, but you have to start paying a cost today. That's what all societies have to do responsibly for their own good and for the global good. That's a very wicked political problem everywhere. And it explains why the world has been far too slow to move. So we've got to be not comparing an ideal solution with an imperfect solution, but comparing all the imperfects with each other and trying to make each of them acquire some momentum so that we get serious and start getting more urgent about all actions, government policy action, financial institutions, innovations being incentivized and scaled up, and developing the carbon credit market together with other credit markets, because it's also a source of finance. in an environment where finance is so palpably weak. We should not slow down any of the processes, including, by the way, improving the integrity of the carbon credit market in its conventional sense. And that's why I talk about stapling on and not creating a whole new framework. For the very same reason that I think it's going to be very hard to create a whole new framework, even for biodiversity credits or water credits in their own right. But there are ways in which you can make advances, particularly on water credits, and find ways to staple it on to specific projects and let the market decide and at least move in the right direction. I would also add, biodiversity is bedeviling. It's extremely complex, as you say. Water is not as beguiling. Water can be measured. You know what it is. It's not so different from carbon. In fact, it's better because you can see it, by the way. You know through satellite technology how much water is left in the soil, what's happening in the forests. You know how much water is being wasted and conserved. You know whether water is polluted and what it is polluted by. These things are observable. The methods are there. So water, I would say, is much closer to carbon than it is to biodiversity when it comes to the practical tasks of us finding ways of pricing and thinking of the full social costs of mismanaging water, and for us to be able to devise water credits that can be stapled on to carbon credits without slowing any of the processes down. But let's not compare the ideal world, which all of us would like to have, and we feel very strongly that there's something wrong in the system if we're not making enough progress. Let's find all the imperfect mechanisms, find ways to help all the imperfect mechanisms work better.
Sherry, we'll turn to you now. I mean, the issue of complexity is obviously not just a political/policy issue. It's also a technical issue. From the perspective of data and the kind of technologies which I would imagine and innovations that exist in making sure that data gets better and better, where do you see us addressing that complexity?
You're asking me the question about complexity.
Yeah.
I get the win today then.
Yes.
It is complex. And look at what we've all achieved, as society when we put our mind to it. And if you actually talk about the financial markets, my own background is in the financial markets, and some people look at it and say, wow, that's incredibly complicated. We've created all these systems, all these ways of money flowing, all these ways of making money that are incredibly complicated. So I would say that is really an excuse. Really what we need to think about is what progress we can make on the basis of measuring and managing. And think about actually let the data start speaking for if we are being successful or if we aren't. Of course, I would say that. But I also think that we are talking a lot about risks, and that's something that CDP captures, right? CDP captures corporate and city, state, and region. What are your risks? How are you seeing the impacts not only of climate, but also of nature loss, et cetera? What about the opportunities? How can we actually start leaning into thinking there is a problem here, and how is it that we can create a financially gaining opportunity? This is the currency of our language. And if we can start thinking about that, we can start directing capital in a way that we can then measure and manage even better. And this is not just a fiction. Last year, CDP's questionnaire unearthed $16 trillion worth of opportunity that came from the analysis that the companies did to think about a better and more sustainable business model. If we look at, we're sitting in Europe right now, 3.47 trillion euros worth of opportunity came from this region. And we asked the question, how much would it cost to be able to unlock that? Because of course, it's never one side in a financial argument. The other side said 620 billion euros. 620 billion, 3.47 trillion. How can we make that part of the nomenclature and the thinking about how we unlock this supposed complexity when we're actually gaining on both sides, not only for our planet, but also for the system that we've created as an economy? I think speaking increasingly the language of ethics and environmentalism is continuing to be important. It brings us our social capital. It brings us what it is that we want to see. But this is an economic question. And if we can place it in the world of economics, I think that's where we see some possible future.
Matt, I've got to turn the questions to you now. I mean, we all know that within certain circles and the perceptions of carbon markets can be improved in terms of public trust, in terms of the ability of it to drive action even harder. What's needed in terms of improving how we talk about nature markets, if we're going to get there in driving action, in convincing the public, in convincing your stakeholders that this will work, that there is a possibility that this will work, as President Tharman has suggested, that we may have no option. What's needed to better make the argument for combining the three nature markets?
Well, as I said before, I think I'm probably challenged the notion that there's no alternatives, right? I think I pointed to some of the alternatives. I think very strong regulations, public taking charge of actually setting parameters for what is allowed, what is not allowed, finding financing through other sources. I think that's the solution, right? But I think buying your premise and saying, okay, how would we make nature markets work out, right? I mean, I think you're right. The first problem really is credibility, right? We have a situation where we have, I think, more than 2 decades experience now with credit markets, right? We see 90% of the credits that are being sold by the biggest players on that market for tropical forest credits are fraud, fake, right? We see massive problems with examples all over the place with how it has been misused and how it's driving the wrong solutions, right? We see, yes, you may protect an area here, right? But then the logging happens here. That's very difficult, and maybe it's my limited imagination, right? But I simply can't see how we could avoid these mechanisms. I think inherently there is something unjust in the situation where we create a market that is based by those who are operating within it, and not by those who may be directly impacted by it on the ground. Right? I think this is an inequity and an injustice that is inbuilt in that approach. And I think the larger we make these markets, the higher that risk will be. Yeah. So I really think that this will be difficult territory. That doesn't mean that, I mean, I believe in data, I believe in science, right? I think we can get a very long way. And I think all the work that you're doing, excellent work, I've seen a lot of it, right, is super helpful also when we start talking about how do we actually directly tax those who are using our nature. Super useful, but I think we have to be very, very careful and realistic about the downsides of implementing very big markets. We've seen how long time we spent just on getting the most simple one-dimensional market up and running, the ETS in Europe or the 74 other direct emission schemes we have in place right now. It's taken so long time, and that's so simple, right? It's one-dimensional, and you can trade it, and as you say, it's global, and it's. But here we're talking about water, for example. There's a fundamental human right to access to water. How do you factor that into a market? You can, of course, do it, but we've seen already examples from those places in the world that has liberalized their water markets, that have started to trade these things, how these unfairness and injustices start to trickle through. So my imagination is struggling to come up with a good answer to.
Okay. Since you mentioned water, I'm going to ask President Tharman to use his experience in dealing with the issue within the work that is done with the Global Commission, and turn towards talking about public-private partnerships as an example of how both sides can work together. Are there approaches that we've seen specifically towards the issue of water in addressing some of the complexities that they've raised, that we can actually say, look, this works, and this is something that we can try and transpose or at least work on as we look towards bringing markets such as biodiversity and combining it, coalescing it with carbon?
So I think first, Matt makes an important point. We've got to make sure that the effort and energy that goes into developing carbon markets, ideally carbon with some stapling on of biodiversity and water, doesn't distract us from the fundamental solutions. The fundamental solutions especially lie in public policy. They lie in pricing, taxes and subsidies. They lie in regulation, including mandated conversion from one system of using energy to another. which has been slow. I think we take a great risk if we were to put everything by stall or public policy, given how fragile the political economy has been. We've got to keep pushing. We've got to use the young. We've got to find new ways in which scientists and economists explain the problem so that people realize it's in their interests to go along with it. But we take a large risk if we simply argue for the right thing to be done, knowing full well that the right thing it's taken a very long time for political systems, ordinary people, to recognize that it needs to be done. Keep pushing at it. And I'm not at all saying that let's start carbon markets because we give up on that. And we've got to be careful, as you say, to avoid distracting from that central task. But let's push on all fronts, because everything has been imperfect and everything needs to be worked on much harder. Carbon markets are fundamentally an important source of finance, particularly for lower income and lower middle income countries, even middle income countries. They need greater integrity. The situation is not as dire as often portrayed. I mean, if you look at people like Silvera, they would assess that about 30% of the credits to date are actually high integrity. And then there's some bad examples that give the whole business a bad reputation, right? But it's not so bad. But you've got to make sure that the vast majority of credits are high integrity. And I don't think it's beyond our wherewithal to be able to achieve it. As Madera says, it's not beyond us to be able to achieve it. And I dare say it's a task that in many ways comes down to practicality without being bedeviled by all the political economy constraints that we face. We need better third-party verifiers. We need independent civil society casting a very careful eye on what's going on. And you need leading businesses, many of which actually are very high integrity businesses, leading businesses to show the way. It's going to be imperfect, but let's move in the right direction. So that's basically where I'm coming from. I agree with you entirely. We're not going to get to net zero. We're not going to keep warming below 2 degrees. 1.5 is already gone. We're not going to keep it below 2 degrees without much more honest and bold public policy. We're moving a little bit in the other direction right now, but we've got to keep pushing and we've got to mobilize public opinion, including the young, to get us there. But at the same time, recognize that we shouldn't go slow on many of the other initiatives that have to go together with public policy. The private sector has to move. There are ways in which you can move and earn a decent return, sometimes very good returns. That doesn't make it a bad thing when they earn good returns. You've got to look at whether people are disadvantaged by the private sector action. So if indeed there's a system of carbon credits and reforestation projects or preservation of forests that ignores the interests of the people who are actually there on the ground, either workers or indigenous people, that's an issue to look at. That's a problem to look at. It doesn't mean it's intrinsically a bad scheme or program. It means it may be poorly implemented, and regulators are not doing their job, and bad guys are allowed to operate freely. But the world has bad guys everywhere, in every sphere of action, right? So let's improve how we do things, get independent civil society more engaged, and find ways in which the scientists and economists can make the case persuasively, particularly for ordinary people, and not make it so easy for politicians to get off the hook.
Thank you, Mr. President. We've very quickly running out of time, so I'm going to conclude this. Maybe we go from Cenk, Mads, Sherry, and then President Tharman very quickly to conclude. As you say, the political economy is getting more complicated. We're not entering a stage where global collaboration or cooperation is going to get any easier. So from your own perspectives, what do you think we really need, at least ideally, to be able to at least make these first steps, whether it's, as President Tharman said, using the WEF to push action, whether we use public-private partnerships to push action, or even individually as a business, what are you doing to push actions, whether or not it is market-based or not, whether or not it is through other Earth-positive measures. But let's go through and tell us your concluding thoughts on that.
I think we have a big learning from tech industry. They have this methodology of agile and then concept of minimum viable product. So they come to market with a minimum viable product, they see the attraction, and then they improve it, they improve it. I think in sustainability in these markets, we should implement the same methodology. So we should be agile, we should come up with the first minimum viable products. Today it is carbon. Let's see what's happened. Then, as you said, Mr. President, stack on, water on it. If it works, then move to the next round, move to the next cycle. So, because, the technology markets, they are uncertain markets also. There is lots of complexities over there, etc. But how these guys are tackled with this problem, with the concept of agile, running continuously, and then the concept of minimum viable product. I think we can learn and copy-paste this to our industry, sustainability industry.
Thank you. Mads?
I have great respect for the president and consider him very wise, but I think I will still hold on to the thought that I think our best chance for scale, for speed, is to focus on taxation. Right? So that means, of course, also nature taxation. Right? It's really about that, and therefore we also need the right metrics to do that, etc. But taxation of the use of common goods, the access to the extreme wealth we see accumulating at the moment, these two are the most and fastest way to provide the funding gaps that we are needing, and that will hopefully provide the policy space that are needed in this very difficult political economic environment right now.
Sherry?
I think Earth-positive action is no longer a business nice to have. It's a business must have. So how is it that we actually lean into the numbers? The companies that disclose to CDP, within 2 years after the first time they disclose, their emissions go down 7 to 10%. So let's take a good bit from what we've been doing about carbon and climate and bring that into nature, water, biodiversity, and see that same sort of drop, because we can measure it, and then we can actually continue down the positive path.
Sorry for the noise, Mr. President. If you could just speak above the noise and conclude. Thank you.
It's early applause, right?
Well, it's either that or it's not a very good gymnast. First, I quite agree, and I've said this many times before publicly, that we are not going to be able to get to where we need to without some form of carbon pricing that's globally coordinated and that's fair to the developing world, particularly low-income countries. We might not be able to get there through multilateral action, but we've got to get there somehow through plurilateral action, or sometimes even unilateral action plus incentives for the low-income world. We've got to move in that direction. There's no doubt about it. And I don't think this is mutually exclusive with moving on every other front that takes us in the same direction of unleashing financing for investments in the preservation of natural ecosystems, in the conservation of water, and in the reduction of carbon emissions. It's a massive task, and we need every source of finance to be unleashed. Bank finance, traditional capital markets, not working very well because they price the risk too high for much of the developing world, and carbon credits, an improved, well-verified, high-integrity system of carbon credits. Let's work on all these fronts at the same time and never let it distract from the fundamental public policy task. I quite agree with that.
President Tharman, Jerry, Mads, Cenk, if it helps on behalf of the organizers, I apologize for the noise, but thank you for powering through. For those here, thank you very much. Thank you.